Could you please explain to the courts the relationship you had with Mrs. Stark?
Yes, Mary and I had become dear friends over the time I'd cared for her. It felt like we'd known each other all of our lives. We were very close.
And could you please explain what you were treating Mrs. Stark for?
She was terminally ill with bowel cancer. She'd had this for 2.5 years. She was strong in the beginning, but as she worsened, she was then diagnosed with dementia.
And could you please tell me when Mrs. Stark first asked you to help her to commit suicide?
It was the day I first met her. She told me that her mother had suffered with cancer to a point where she didn't know who or where she was. And she said that she didn't want to go like that herself.
And how many times did she ask you?
I've lost count. At least once a day.
Wow, that must be 1,000 times. She was obviously very sure she wanted you to help her.
Yes, definitely. She begged me. I spoke to my superiors about it, but nobody helped. The pain was so great. Nothing would touch it.
I put it to the court that Mrs. Wilson was acting out of kindness. Having a good relationship with Mrs. Stark, she wanted the best for a friend. No one wishes to see anybody suffer. My client did what she believed was the right thing to do. Something she was excessively asked to do by Mrs. Stark. No further questions, Your Honour. Your witness.
As we have heard, Mrs. Wilson, you have admitted to assisting Mr. Stark to die on the 22nd of February 2014. Can you tell me why you gave Mrs. Stark the overdose that killed her?
I did it because she begged me to do it for nearly 2.5 years. She said she couldn't live with the pain anymore and she wanted it to stop. So I helped her to go to a better place.
Do you know what happens to a person when they die, Mrs. Wilson?
No.
No. So, how would you know that she would be going to a better place?
I don't understand the question.
You may have thought you were helping Mrs. Wilson, but in reality, no one knows what happens after death. So you cannot assume you were helping the patient and stopping the suffering. Can you, Mrs. Wilson? You have simply taken a life away.
That's unfair. You don't know the amount of pain she was in. She suffered every day for many years.
As a nurse at the hospice, Mrs. Wilson, were you aware that the patient was suffering from dementia?
Objection, Your Honour. She's trying to ridicule my client.
Overruled. You may answer, Mrs. Wilson.
Yes, I knew that she had dementia, but she hadn't suffered from this long term. She always said that the pain was too great and that she wanted to die.
So, as a nurse, you are aware that dementia is a disease of the mind, where a person suffers from memory loss, struggles to understand reality, and quite often makes no sense at all.
It wasn't like that. I'd treated her enough for years, and I knew how she wanted to end her life.
And finally, Mrs. Wilson, you have told the court that you have known the patient for around 2.5 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Well, Mrs. Stark's daughter, Denise, had known her mother for 54 years. Denise and her family were very much against assisting Mrs. Stark to die. Their wish was to keep her with them, for her to die naturally when the time was right. Yet you still took matters into your own hands, didn't you, Mrs. Wilson? Do you honestly think that you knew Mrs. Stark better than her own family did? Than her own daughter, who had been raised by her and known her for 54 years of her life?
Well,
Please just answer the question, Mrs. Wilson. Did you know Mrs. Stark better than her own daughter did?
no, I didn't.
No. No further questions, Your Honour.